They came for me on a Tuesday morning in March 1984, three men in dark suits driving a government sedan with plates that didn't exist in any DMV database. I know because I checked later, during those first paranoid weeks when I still thought I could understand what was happening through normal channels of information. The lead agent's name was Richardson, though I doubt that was real. Nothing about them was real except their authority and their knowledge of something I'd spent 14 years trying to keep secret. Dr. Marcus Webb, Richardson said, not a question but a statement, standing on my porch in Missoula, Montana, while early spring snow melted in dirty patches across my front yard. We need to discuss your annual pilgrimages to the Bitterroot Range. Specifically, we need to discuss what you've been meeting there since 1970. My blood went cold. Not the metaphorical cold of fear, but actual physiological response, my body temperature dropping as adrenaline flooded my system. Because there was only one way they could know about the meetings. Only one way they could have connected my yearly disappearances into the wilderness with something specific, something they were tracking. They'd been watching. Not me. Them. I'm a wildlife biologist by training, or I was before all this started. My specialty was large mammal behavior, with a focus on grizzly bears and their adaptation to human encroachment. Respectable work. Published papers. A tenure-track position at the University of Montana. A quiet life built on scientific method and peer-reviewed evidence. That was my cover story, the life I showed the world. But every August for 14 years, I'd taken 2 weeks of personal time, loaded my truck with camping equipment, and driven deep into the Bitterroot wilderness to meet with something that wasn't supposed to exist. Richardson smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. May we come in, Dr. Webb? This conversation would be better conducted inside, away from neighbors and their curiosity. I let them in because refusing would have changed nothing. They had the kind of authority that didn't require warrants or permission. I'd seen it before, during my brief stint as a consultant for the Forest Service in the mid-70s, when government agencies were scrambling to manage the fallout from environmental legislation and the growing public awareness of endangered species. I'd seen how certain files got classified, how certain sightings got explained away, how certain truths got buried under layers of bureaucratic denial. We sat in my living room, them on my couch, me in my reading chair, and Richardson opened a briefcase that looked expensive and well-traveled. He removed a folder, thick with documents, and placed it on my coffee table. We've been aware of the North American Gigantopithecus population since 1967, he said, using a term I'd never heard applied to them before. Scientific nomenclature for something that existed in the gap between science and myth. Various agencies have been monitoring their movements, their population dynamics, their interactions with humans. It's delicate work, Dr. Webb. Work that requires discretion and, unfortunately, often requires intervention. Gigantopithecus went extinct thousands of years ago, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. In Asia, the fossil record is clear. The Asian populations, yes. But North America is a different story. A story that officially doesn't exist, that can't exist, because the implications would be catastrophic for land management, resource extraction, endangered species legislation, indigenous land claims, and about a dozen other policy areas that are already political minefields. He opened the folder and showed me photographs. Not the blurry, questionable images that circulated in tabloids and conspiracy magazines. These were clear, taken with professional equipment, showing creatures I recognized immediately. My friends, my teachers, the beings I'd been meeting with for 14 years in a clearing deep in the Bitterroot Range, where they'd first approached me during a solo camping trip in 1970. We know about your meetings, Richardson continued. We know they initiated contact with you, not the other way around. We know you've kept detailed journals, though you've been smart enough not to publish or share them. We know you've been learning from them, documenting their language, their social structure, their understanding of the ecosystem they inhabit. He pulled out another document, and I felt my stomach drop. It was a photocopy of a journal entry I'd written 3 years ago, describing a conversation about climate patterns and how the creatures had noticed changes in snow depth and timing that preceded what humans were just beginning to call global warming. "How did you get that?" I asked, though I already knew. They'd been in my house. They'd been through my things. They'd probably bugged my office, my truck, maybe even the wilderness sites where I met with the creatures. The question isn't how, Dr. Webb. The question is what happens next. Because your unique relationship with these beings has caught the attention of several government agencies, and not all of them share the same priorities. The file he showed me next contained satellite imagery of the Bitterroot Range, thermal signatures marked in red, movement patterns tracked over years. They'd been watching from space, from hidden cameras, from distances I'd thought were safe. And what they documented wasn't just my meetings. It was a population, a community, a species clinging to survival in the last wild spaces of North America. What I learned in that living room would shatter my understanding of what governments do with knowledge that's too dangerous to acknowledge. Subscribe now to discover what happens when scientific wonder becomes national security threat. To understand what happened in 1984, you need to understand how it began. How a skeptical young biologist became a believer, then a witness, then something I still don't have adequate words for. Friend seems inadequate. Colleague implies a quality we don't have. Student captures part of it, but not the reciprocity. Perhaps the best word is simply connected. I was 26 in August 1970, fresh from my doctorate at Berkeley, full of scientific confidence and the arrogance of someone who thought understanding could be achieved through observation and measurement. I'd taken a position at the University of Montana specifically for access to the Northern Rockies, for the chance to study grizzly behavior in one of their last strongholds. My plan was to spend that first summer establishing baseline data, finding bear sign, setting up observation posts. The Bitterroot Range wasn't my primary research area, but I'd heard stories from local hunters and loggers about a valley where animals behaved strangely, where elk would suddenly bolt for no visible reason, where experienced outdoorsmen reported feeling washed with an intensity that sent them back to their trucks. Superstition and campfire tales, I'd assumed. But good scientists investigate anomalies, so I'd packed 3 weeks of supplies and hiked 12 miles into the backcountry to see for myself. The first week was unremarkable. I saw black bears, documented their feeding patterns, took soil and vegetation samples. Normal field work. The second week, things changed. I started finding tracks that didn't match any species in my field guides. Bipedal, definitely. Human-sized but wrong. The toe spread too wide. The depth suggesting weight no human could achieve without equipment. The stride length was impossible, 7 feet or more between impressions. I photographed them, made plaster casts, measured every detail with the precision my training demanded. And I tried very hard to convince myself they were hoaxes or bear tracks I was misinterpreting or anything except what my gut already knew they were. On the 14th night, I woke to find my campsite rearranged. Not destroyed or ransacked, but reorganized. My food bags, which I'd hung from a tree using proper bear avoidance protocols, had been lowered to the ground and placed in a neat circle around my tent. My cooking equipment sat stacked in order of size. Even my scattered notes had been gathered and weighted down with stones to prevent them blowing away. The message was unmistakable. You're being sloppy. Pay attention. We're watching, and we're not impressed with your wilderness skills. I should have been terrified. Any rational person would have been. Instead, I felt something closer to embarrassment, like a student caught making obvious mistakes by a professor. I called out into the darkness, "Thank you. I apologize for the mess." Silence. Just the normal sounds of a mountain night, wind moving through pine trees, a creek burbling nearby, the distant call of an owl. But the silence felt different now, populated, as if the darkness was listening. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting outside my tent, making no sudden movements. When the sun finally rose, I found a gift. A massive elk antler, recently shed, placed carefully across the entrance to my tent in a position that couldn't have been accidental. Antlers were valuable, both for the minerals in them and as trophies. This was an offering, a gesture of what? Acknowledgement? Acceptance? I spent that day reorganizing my camp properly, taking care with every detail, treating the wilderness with the respect I should have shown from the beginning. That night, they came closer. I heard footsteps circling my camp, heavy and deliberate. I heard breathing, deep and rhythmic, from something with lung capacity far exceeding human norms. And I heard vocalizations, low-frequency sounds that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears, sounds that carried meaning I couldn't yet decipher, but recognized as language. "I mean no harm," I said into the darkness. "I'm here to learn, to understand. I'll leave when you want me to leave." A sound came from the trees, something between a grunt and a sigh. Then silence again. But this time, the silence felt different. Not hostile or evaluative, just patient. They were giving me time to adjust, to accept what my eyes would see if I was willing to look. On the 16th night, they revealed themselves. There were 3 of them that first night, though I'd later learned there were 7 in the immediate family group, and perhaps 40 in the broader regional population. They emerged from the tree line just after sunset, when the light was dim enough to soften details, but bright enough to make their forms unmistakable. The largest stood perhaps 9 feet tall, with shoulders so broad it seemed physically impossible, covered in thick, reddish-brown fur that was groomed and maintained, not the matted mess I'd expected from wilderness animals. They moved with a grace that belied their size, each step placed carefully, their bodies held in postures that communicated intention and emotion as clearly as human body language. The largest one, who I'd eventually come to think of as the elder, raised one hand in what was clearly a gesture of peace. The other 2, smaller but still massive by human standards, held back, watching with an intensity that suggested they were learning from this encounter as much as I was. I stood slowly, keeping my hands visible and empty. Every instinct from my bear research kicked in. Appear non-threatening, avoid direct eye contact, move predictably. But these weren't bears. The intelligence in their eyes, the deliberateness of their approach, the clear structure of their group dynamics, this was something different entirely. The elder approached to within 10 feet and stopped. This close, I could see details that photographs never captured. The face was a blend of ape and human features, with a prominent brow ridge, but eyes that were unervingly expressive. The hands were enormous, but showed remarkable dexterity, fingers moving in small gestures that I'd later recognize as sign language. The smell was intense, a musk that wasn't unpleasant but was definitely non-human, speaking to different biology, different evolutionary paths. We stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, just looking at each other. I was crying, I realized, tears streaming down my face. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming recognition of what I was experiencing. This was first contact. This was the discovery that humanity wasn't alone, that intelligence had evolved along multiple paths, that the world was larger and stranger than our maps suggested. The elder made a sound, a low rumbling that I felt in my bones. Then it gestured toward itself, toward the others, and toward the surrounding forest. The meaning was clear. This is our home. You are a guest. Behave accordingly. I nodded. I understand. I'll respect your space. Thank you for trusting me enough to reveal yourselves. What happened over the next 4 days changed everything I thought I knew about intelligence, communication, and what it meant to be human. They taught me, with patience that suggested they'd done this before with other humans, carefully chosen ones. They taught me their signs, the gestures they used to communicate complex ideas when vocalizations weren't appropriate. They showed me their food sources, their sleeping sites, their social hierarchies. They demonstrated tool use that rivaled early human technology. Stones shaped for specific purposes, sticks modified for digging, plants harvested and processed with clear understanding of their properties. But the most profound lesson came on the final night, when the elder led me to a ridge overlooking a valley. Below, I could see lights from a logging town, roads cutting through forest, the evidence of human expansion. The elder pointed at the lights, then at the shrinking forest around us, then at its own chest. The meaning was unmistakable. Your kind is taking our world. Soon there will be nowhere left for us. I spent that night writing frantically in my journal, documenting everything, trying to capture the magnitude of what I'd learned. When I woke at dawn, they were gone. But on my camp table, weighted down with stones, was a bundle of carefully selected items. Medicinal plants I hadn't known grew in the area, a perfectly napped stone tool, and a tuft of fur. Gifts, evidence, a promise that this wasn't the last meeting. I found a note I'd written myself that morning, 16 years ago. I've been chosen for something I don't fully understand. They need witnesses. They need humans who know they exist, who can perhaps advocate for their survival as the world closes in around them. I have to come back. Every year. For as long as they'll have me. For 14 years, I kept that promise. Every August, I returned. Every August, they taught me more. I learned their history, their understanding of ecology, their views on the human species that was systematically destroying their habitat. I became fluent in their sign language, could identify individuals by gait and gesture, understood the complex social bonds that held their families together. But I also understood the danger. Not to me. They'd never shown aggression. The danger was in revealing their existence to a world that would react with fear, exploitation, or systematic eradication. So I stayed silent, published nothing, told no one. Until the government found out anyway. Continue reading to discover what they wanted from me, and what price they demanded for my years of secret communion with creatures that officially don't exist. Richardson waited until I'd finished looking through the file, through the photographs and satellite imagery and detailed surveillance logs that proved they knew almost as much about my meetings as I did. Almost, but not quite. They knew when and where. They knew who I met with. But they didn't know what we discussed, what I'd learned, what kind of understanding had developed over 14 years of careful, mutual education. "We need your cooperation, Dr. Webb," Richardson said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "The agency I represent has been monitoring the North American Gigantopithecus population for nearly 2 decades. We have evidence of at least 17 distinct family groups across the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, and parts of the Cascades. Maybe 300 individuals total, possibly fewer. They're endangered, functionally extinct in terms of genetic diversity, and caught between human expansion and climate change with nowhere to go." "Which agency?" I asked. He smiled that non-smile again. "One that doesn't appear on organizational charts. Let's just say we handle anomalies that don't fit into neat bureaucratic categories. Species that officially don't exist. Phenomena that can't be explained through conventional science. Problems that require unconventional solutions. You want to study them?" "No, Dr. Webb. We've been studying them. We want to save them. Or more accurately, We want you to help us determine if they can be saved and at what cost." He pulled out another set of documents, these marked with classification stamps I recognized from my brief government consulting work. Top secret, compartmentalized, need-to-know basis only. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act became law. It's been a political nightmare ever since, stopping development projects, complicating resource extraction, giving environmental groups legal weapons they never had before. Now imagine what happens if word gets out that we have an undiscovered hominid species living in our national forests. A species that would immediately qualify as endangered, that would require massive habitat protection, that would make the spotted owl controversy look like a minor disagreement. I started to understand. This wasn't about science or conservation. This was about control, about managing a truth that was too disruptive to acknowledge. The logging industry would collapse, Richardson continued. Every national forest with possible habitat would be closed to resource extraction. Property rights in rural areas would be compromised. Indigenous groups could make unprecedented land claims. The economic and political implications are catastrophic. "So you want them to stay hidden," I said. "You want me to help you keep the secret. We want you to help us understand them well enough to manage the situation. They've survived this long by avoiding humans, by staying in the most remote areas, by being intelligent enough to remain hidden. But that's becoming impossible. Satellite coverage is improving. Thermal imaging is getting cheaper. Hikers and climbers are penetrating deeper into the backcountry every year. It's only a matter of time before someone gets conclusive evidence, posted online, triggers a media firestorm we can't control." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "You have a relationship with them that's unique, Dr. Webb. 14 years of trust building. They communicate with you. They teach you. You might be the only human alive who could convince them to cooperate with a managed survival strategy." Which is what exactly? Relocation to designated protected areas that we can secure and monitor. Areas where we can ensure their survival without risking public discovery. Think of it as a witness protection program for an entire species. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and immediate. "You want to put them in a zoo. A very large, very remote zoo, but a zoo nonetheless. We want to keep them alive, Dr. Webb. The alternative is extinction. If they're discovered naturally, the public reaction will be chaos. Some people will want them protected, others will see them as threats or scientific specimens to be studied invasively. Hunters will want trophies. The government will face impossible pressure from every direction. And in the middle of all that noise and conflict, the creatures themselves will be forgotten, reduced to symbols in political battles they don't understand." Richardson pulled out one final document, a contract of some kind. "We're offering you a position as a special consultant. Classified work, classified pay grade. Your job would be to act as liaison between us and the creatures, to convince them that cooperation is in their best interest, to help facilitate the relocation when the time comes. And if I refuse?" His expression hardened. "Then we move forward without your input, and I can't guarantee we'll prioritize their well-being over operational efficiency. You're not the only one who knows about them, Dr. Webb. You're just the only one they trust. That trust makes you valuable, but it doesn't make you indispensable." The threat was clear. Cooperate, or be sidelined while less careful people handled a situation I'd spent 14 years trying to protect. But there was another option, one Richardson hadn't explicitly mentioned but that hung in the air between us. I could warn them. I could go to the Bitterroot Range and tell my friends that the government knew about them, that everything was about to change, that they needed to run or hide or prepare for what was coming. The question was whether I could reach them before Richardson's people stopped me. and whether warning them would save them or just accelerate their destruction. They gave me until August to decide. "Take your usual trip," Richardson said as they left my house that Tuesday morning. "Meet with them. Observe their situation. Think about what's really best for their long-term survival. We'll reconvene when you return, and you can give us your answer then." It was a test, obviously. They'd be watching to see if I ran, if I tried to warn the creatures, if I attempted to contact media or academic colleagues who might help resist whatever the government was planning. But more than that, it was a psychological manipulation. By giving me time, by framing the choice as mine, they were making me complicit in whatever came next. If I agreed to help, I'd be betraying beings who'd trusted me for 14 years. If I refused, I'd be abandoning them to people who saw them as problems to be managed rather than persons to be respected. I spent the spring in a fog of indecision and research. I started pulling data on endangered species relocations, reading about the history of government conservation efforts, studying the legal frameworks around species protection. What I found wasn't encouraging. Relocations rarely worked well, especially for species with complex social structures and deep connections to specific territories. The psychological stress alone killed many relocated animals, even when the new habitat seemed physically suitable. But Richardson was also right about the impossibility of their current situation. Every year, I'd seen signs of the shrinking territory available to them. Logging roads penetrated deeper into the backcountry. All-terrain vehicles appeared in places that used to be accessible only by foot. Trail cameras and motion sensors dotted the landscape, set by hunters and wildlife enthusiasts who had no idea what they might actually capture. The creatures were running out of space to hide, and their population was too small to survive much longer without fresh genetic diversity. In June, I received a package at my office. No return address, but clearly from Richardson's people. Inside was a dossier on other humans who'd had contact with the creatures over the years. Loggers who'd reported strange encounters in the 1950s and been quietly paid off to forget what they'd seen. Hunters who'd tracked something impossible and then mysteriously lost interest in pursuing the story. Indigenous elders who carried traditional knowledge about the forest people and maintained careful silence about their existence. The message was clear: you're not special. You're not the first. We've been managing this situation for decades. Don't overestimate your importance or your leverage. But there was one file in the dossier that caught my attention. A report from 1967, the year Richardson had said they became officially aware of the population. It described a logging operation in Oregon that had been shut down after workers reported systematic sabotage. Equipment moved, trails blocked, an unmistakable message to leave the area. The company had pushed ahead anyway, and 2 men had gone missing for 3 days, found eventually at the forest edge, unharmed but deeply traumatized and unwilling to speak about what had happened. The creatures could defend themselves when necessary. They could resist, but doing so increased visibility, increased risk. It was a balance they'd maintained for generations, staying hidden but occasionally pushing back when human encroachment became too direct, too threatening. How long could they maintain that balance? How many more years before the wrong person got the right photograph, before their existence became undeniable? August arrived with the weight of an execution date. I packed my usual gear, but added one item I'd never brought before: a satellite phone Richardson had provided. "In case you need to reach us quickly," he'd said, "or in case of emergency." I understood the real message: we'll be listening. Don't do anything foolish. The drive to the trailhead felt different this time. Every mile marker seemed significant. Every turn potentially the last time I'd make this journey as a free agent with a secret to protect. When I parked my truck and shouldered my pack, I stood for a long moment looking at the wilderness entrance, wondering if I was walking into the last free meeting we'd ever have. The hike-in took 2 days, the familiar trail both comfort and condemnation. I knew these paths so well now, could navigate them in darkness if necessary. But that familiarity was part of the problem. If I could learn the route this thoroughly, so could others. Satellite imagery could map these trails from space. Thermal sensors could detect warm-blooded creatures moving through the forest. The technology of surveillance was improving faster than the creature's ability to adapt to it. When I reached the clearing where we usually met, I set up camp with extra care. Everything had to be perfect for what might be our final conversation. As the sun set and familiar shadows gathered, I felt the presence I'd come to recognize over 14 years. They were here. They'd been watching since I arrived. And somehow, I knew they understood that something had changed, that this August was different from all the others. The elder emerged from the tree line alone this time, a departure from protocol. In 14 years, there had always been at least 2 of them present during meetings, a safety measure that made sense given the risk of human contact. But tonight, the elder came alone, moving with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a difficult conversation they'd been dreading. We sat across from each other in the gathering darkness, and I began to sign the words I'd been practicing for months, the words that would either save them or destroy the fragile trust we'd built. They know. The government knows about you. They want me to help them. I don't know what to do. The elder's response was a single gesture, repeated slowly so I couldn't misunderstand. We know. We've always known. Now comes the choice. We've always known. The elder's signs were deliberate, patient, as if explaining something to a child who'd finally asked the right question but might not like the answer. The darkness had deepened around us, stars emerging in the clear mountain sky. And in that moment, I felt the full weight of my own naivety. 14 years of thinking I was protecting them, when they'd been managing the situation all along. The elder gestured for me to follow and led me deeper into the forest, to a place I'd never been shown before. We walked for nearly an hour, moving through terrain that would have been treacherous for me without the elder's guidance. Finally, we emerged into a narrow canyon, its walls towering above us. And there, protected from satellite view and aerial surveillance, was something I'd never imagined existed, evidence of their true sophistication. The canyon walls were marked with pictographs, hundreds of them, covering decades or perhaps centuries. But these weren't primitive cave paintings. They were detailed records, historical documentation, a visual language that showed the progression of human expansion across North America and the creature's systematic retreat in response. I recognized geographic landmarks, mountain ranges, rivers, significant formations. And I recognized timeline markers, styles of human clothing and equipment that allowed me to roughly date different sections of the record. The most recent section, clearly added within the last few years, showed something that made my stomach clench. Military helicopters, men in uniform, equipment that looked like surveillance technology, and figures representing the creatures, marked with symbols that I'd learned meant watched or tracked. How long? I signed. How long have you known about the government? The elder's response was complex, requiring multiple signs and gestures to convey fully. Since before you were born. They found us in the 1950s, during something they called the Cold War. They thought we might be Russian experiments or evidence of Asian species migrating across the Pacific. They studied us from distance, tried to capture one of us once. It didn't work. We defended ourselves, disappeared deeper into wilderness. They decided we were too dangerous and too disruptive to acknowledge publicly. So they watched, and we watched them watching. The implications were staggering. The government hadn't just discovered the creatures in 1967, as Richardson had claimed. They'd known for decades, had been managing the secret for my entire lifetime. Every supposed UFO sighting in the Pacific Northwest, every unexplained disappearance in the wilderness, every strange encounter that got written off as hoax or hallucination. How many of those had been deliberate misdirection, government efforts to keep the truth hidden? Then why allow me? I signed. Why reveal yourselves to me if you knew I might lead them to you? The elders settled into a sitting position, indicating this would take time to explain properly. What followed was the most profound conversation we'd ever had, conducted through signs and occasional vocalizations, supplemented by drawings in the dirt and gestures toward the pictographs. They had been choosing human contacts for generations, carefully selecting individuals who showed the right combination of respect for wilderness, capacity for discretion, and potential influence in human society. Not many, perhaps one every 10 or 15 years, but enough to maintain a network of human allies who knew the truth and could potentially advocate for them if the situation became desperate. I wasn't the first biologist they'd contacted. In the 1940s, there had been a forest ranger in Oregon. In the 1960s, an anthropologist in Washington. Some of these contacts had maintained the secret. Others had tried to go public and been discredited, their evidence mysteriously lost or debunked, their reputations destroyed by forces they didn't understand were government operations. You were different, the elders signed. You came alone. You came with questions, not assumptions. You listened more than you spoke. And when we tested you, you chose respect over exploitation. So we kept teaching you, hoping you might be the one who could bridge our world and yours when the time came. The time has come. I signed back. Richardson wants to relocate you, put you in protected areas where they can monitor you, control your movements. He says it's for your survival. The elder's response was a sound I'd never heard before, a low rumbling that vibrated through the ground beneath us. It took me a moment to recognize it. Laughter. Dark, bitter laughter at the cosmic joke of being offered imprisonment as salvation. We've heard this before, the elders signed. Different words, same meaning. In the 1970s, they wanted to study us, promise it would be humane, controlled. Some of our young ones believed them, were curious about cooperation. They were taken to a facility in Nevada. We never saw them again. After that, we learned, trust the land, not the ones who claim to own it. My blood ran cold. Richardson had said they'd been monitoring the population since the 60s. He hadn't mentioned capture, facilities, disappearances. How much of what he'd told me was true, and how much was manipulation designed to secure my cooperation? What happened to them? I signed. The ones who were taken? The elder's response was simple but devastating. They died. Not from mistreatment. The humans tried to keep them comfortable. They died from separation. From being cut off from family, from territory, from the land itself. We are not just animals to be relocated like deer or elk. We are bound to place, to each other, to the web of relationships that sustains us. Break those bonds and we die. Slowly, but certainly. We spent the entire night in that canyon, the elders showing me more of their hidden history, explaining the complex reality of a species trying to survive in a world that had no space left for mysteries. As dawn approached, we were joined by others, the family group I'd come to know over 14 years, plus several individuals I'd never met before, suggesting a gathering of representatives from different territories. What followed was effectively a council meeting, and I was being asked to participate not as an observer or student, but as an advocate who might soon have to make choices that would affect their entire species. The burden of that responsibility felt crushing, but I forced myself to focus, to listen, to understand what they needed me to know. A younger female, whom I'd watched grow from adolescent to adult over the years, signed a question that went straight to the heart of the matter. Your government says they want to save us, but they also want to control us. Can you tell which is truth and which is convenience? It was the question I'd been wrestling with for months, ever since Richardson appeared on my doorstep. The honest answer was, I couldn't. Government conservation efforts had saved species from extinction. The bald eagle, the gray wolf, numerous others pulled back from the brink through protective legislation and managed recovery programs. But those were animals without language, without culture, without the capacity to consent to or refuse their own salvation. What did conservation mean for a species intelligent enough to understand what was being done to them? Was it still salvation if it came with permanent surveillance and restricted freedom? When did protection become imprisonment? I don't know. I signed honestly. But I know they won't give up. Richardson made that clear. With or without my help, they'll move forward with their plans. The only question is whether I'm involved, trying to protect your interests, or whether I'm sidelined and someone less sympathetic takes my role. The elder responded with a series of signs that took me a moment to fully comprehend. There is a third option. We leave, not just this territory, but this entire region. Go deep enough into Canadian wilderness that even their satellites and helicopters cannot find us easily. It would mean abandoning hunting grounds we've used for generations, separating family groups, accepting that some of our elders might not survive the journey. But it would preserve our freedom. The choice they were presenting wasn't just about my cooperation with the government. It was about whether I would help facilitate their mass exodus from United States territory, essentially becoming complicit in what would look like an endangered species voluntarily choosing extinction over captivity. The government would never accept that narrative. They'd argue the creatures were being manipulated, that I was acting against conservation interests, that I'd become an eco-terrorist valuing ideology over practical survival. But if I refused to help, if I let Richardson's people proceed with relocation, I'd be betraying everything the creatures had taught me about autonomy and dignity. The stakes were impossibly high, and the margin for error was non-existent. Subscribe to discover how this impossible choice plays out, and what it costs everyone involved. The council continued through the morning, various individuals contributing perspectives and concerns. A young male signed about the difficulties of the Northern Territories, the harsher climate, the different prey animals they'd need to learn to hunt. An elder female signed about family groups that had already fractured under pressure, individuals lost to disease or accidents that might have been survivable with a larger, more stable population. But underneath all the practical concerns ran a deeper current. The fundamental question of whether survival was worth the cost of everything that made their lives meaningful. They weren't just a species. They were a culture with traditions and knowledge and relationships that had developed over millennia. Relocating them, whether to government facilities or remote Canadian wilderness, would sever connections that couldn't be rebuilt in a single generation. As the sun climbed higher, the council reached a consensus, signed by the elder with a formality that suggested this was binding, a decision that would affect their entire population. We will not cooperate with relocation. We will not enter their facilities voluntarily. But we also will not make the journey north without proof that it offers better chance of survival than staying. You must discover what they're not telling you. Find the truth behind their promises. Then we will decide together. I was being asked to spy on my own government, to infiltrate Richardson's operation and extract information they clearly didn't want me to have. It was dangerous, probably illegal, and would almost certainly destroy my career and possibly my freedom if I was caught. But looking at the faces around me, beings I'd come to know as individuals, as friends, as persons deserving of self-determination, I couldn't see any other ethical path forward. I'll do it, I signed. I'll find out what happened to the ones they took in the 70s. I'll learn what their real plans are. But I need time, and I need you to stay hidden better than ever before. No more contact with me until I can guarantee it's safe. They're watching me now, tracking my movements. Any meeting between us gives them more intelligence about your patterns and locations." The elder stood, and the others followed, the council concluding with a ritual I'd witnessed only a few times before. Each individual touched my shoulder in turn, a gesture that conveyed both blessing and burden. I was being entrusted with their survival, and the weight of that trust felt like it might crush me. As they melted back into the forest, disappearing with the silence and skill they'd perfected over generations of necessary invisibility, the elder paused and signed one final message. "Your people have a saying, the truth will set you free. But sometimes truth is a cage that looks like freedom. Be careful which truths you trust." I returned from the mountains with a plan that terrified me and a determination that surprised me. Richardson had given me a role in his operation, assuming my cooperation would be grudging but genuine. He didn't realize he'd also given me access to facilities, to personnel, to classified information that might reveal what really happened to the creatures taken in the 1970s. My first step was to accept his offer officially. I signed the paperwork, underwent the background checks and security clearances, and became Special Consultant Marcus Webb, assigned to Project Elderwood, the classified program managing what the government called North American Gigantopithecus conservation efforts. The clearances took 6 weeks to process. During that time, I was given limited briefing materials, sanitized reports about population estimates and habitat requirements, carefully curated to present the government's approach as thoughtful and scientifically sound. But I was also given access to a research facility in Montana, a converted Forest Service station where Project Elderwood maintained its primary operational base. That's where I met Dr. Catherine Mills, a primatologist who'd been with the project since its inception in the late 1960s. She was in her 60s now, still sharp, but carrying a weariness that spoke to decades of working in the shadows on a problem without clear solutions. Unlike Richardson, whose motivations were primarily political and strategic, Catherine genuinely cared about the creature's welfare. But she'd also been part of the system long enough to have made compromises, accepted limitations, participated in decisions that haunted her. We bonded over late-night discussions about primate cognition and social structures, and gradually, carefully, I began asking questions about the project's history. Catherine was cautious at first, aware that everything was probably monitored. But over time, I detected hints of someone who wanted to tell the truth, who was tired of carrying secrets alone. The 1970s were a different time. She told me one night over coffee in the facility's break room, speaking in the careful abstractions of someone working around surveillance. We had less oversight, more autonomy to pursue aggressive research strategies. Some of us believed we were pioneers, that studying them closely could revolutionize our understanding of evolution and cognition. Others were more concerned with containment, with ensuring they didn't become a political problem. What happened to the specimens that were brought in for study? I asked, using the clinical language that made the conversation sound official rather than accusatory. Catherine's expression darkened. They didn't adapt well to captivity. We tried everything. Large enclosures, enrichment activities, minimal human contact. But they declined rapidly. Physical health remained stable, but behaviorally. She paused, choosing her words carefully. It was like watching the light go out of someone's eyes. They stopped eating properly, stopped engaging with their environment. Within 18 months, all 3 subjects had died. Causes ranging from infection to what the medical staff termed failure to thrive. 3. The elder had said some of our young ones, without specifying a number. 3 individuals lost to curiosity and misplaced trust, inhuman promises. 3. Catherine confirmed. 2 males, 1 female, all young adults. The facility was in Nevada, operated by a contractor working under Department of Defense oversight. It was shut down after the subjects died, and the records were classified at the highest level. Officially, the research never happened. But I was there, Dr. Webb. I was one of the researchers who thought we were doing something important, something that would help us protect them better. Instead, we killed them through our own ignorance and arrogance. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and carried too many regrets. That's why I support the current relocation strategy, despite its limitations. We learned from those deaths that captivity, even benevolent captivity, is lethal for them. The new plan involves much larger territories, minimal human contact, careful monitoring of social groups to ensure we don't disrupt their natural dynamics. It's not perfect, but it's based on hard-learned lessons about what doesn't work. But they'd still be confined, I said. Still under surveillance. Still living in territories they didn't choose, following rules they didn't agree to. The alternative is extinction, Dr. Webb. Their current population is below the minimum viable threshold for long-term survival. Genetic diversity is critically low. Without intervention, they'll be gone within 2 or 3 generations, victims of inbreeding depression and simple bad luck. At least relocation gives them a chance. I wanted to believe her. The data she showed me was compelling. Population models, genetic analyses, projections that all pointed toward inevitable decline without intervention. But I kept thinking about the elders' words. We died from separation, from being cut off from family, from territory, from the land itself. That night, I broke into Catherine's office. Not physically. The security was too tight for that. But I'd learned enough about the facility's computer systems to exploit a vulnerability, accessing files that were restricted even for most project personnel. What I found in those files changed everything I thought I understood about Project Elderwood and its true objectives. The classified documents I extracted from Catherine's secured files painted a picture very different from the conservation narrative Richardson and his colleagues had presented. Project Elderwood wasn't primarily about saving an endangered species. It was about controlling a potential security threat and exploiting a unique biological resource. The earliest documents, dating from the 1950s and early 1960s, framed the creatures as potential enemy assets. During the Cold War paranoia, some military officials had theorized they might be Soviet experiments in creating enhanced soldiers or evidence of Asian species that could be weaponized. When that proved false, attention shifted to their potential value for American military and intelligence purposes. Documents from the 1970s, the period when the 3 young creatures had been captured, detailed research objectives that had nothing to do with conservation. They'd been studying the creatures' remarkable strength-to-weight ratio, their ability to thermoregulate in extreme cold, their apparent resistance to altitude sickness, and most disturbing, their capacity for what researchers termed advanced cognitive operations, including strategic thinking and interspecies communication. The creatures hadn't died from failure to adapt to captivity. They died from invasive research procedures, from stress testing that pushed their physiological limits, from cognitive experiments that treated them as subjects rather than persons. Catherine's sanitized version, Failure to Thrive, was technically accurate but morally obscene. But the most damning documents were recent, dated within the last 2 years. Project Elderwood had received renewed funding and expanded mandates, not for conservation, but for what was termed biosecurity preparedness. The reasoning was chillingly pragmatic. If the creature's existence became public, they would immediately become subject to international attention. Other nations might attempt to locate and study them. Corporate interests might seek to exploit their unique biology. The United States needed to secure the population first, control access to specimens, and ensure that any knowledge gained would remain proprietary. The relocation plan wasn't about giving them better habitat. It was about concentrating the population in areas where the government could maintain total control, where every individual could be monitored constantly, where breeding could be managed and specimens could be collected for research purposes under the guise of veterinary care or scientific study. I sat in the darkness of my quarters, staring at the documents I'd printed before wiping my digital tracks, and felt sick. Richardson had been right about one thing. The creatures were running out of time. But the government's solution wasn't salvation. It was a different kind of extinction, one that preserved their bodies while destroying everything that made them who they were. I had the proof the elder requested. I knew the truth behind the government's promises. But knowing the truth didn't solve the fundamental problem. The creatures were caught between slow extinction and shrinking territories and accelerated destruction through government intervention. The only remaining option was the one I'd been avoiding, the choice that would make me a criminal and a fugitive but might give them a real chance at autonomous survival. I had to help them disappear, completely, permanently, in a way that would make even satellite surveillance useless. And I had maybe 2 weeks before Richardson realized I'd accessed files I shouldn't have seen. Subscribe to discover how we attempted the impossible, erasing an entire species from government records while keeping them alive in territories no one knew existed. The next morning, I submitted my resignation from Project Elderwood, citing philosophical differences with program objectives. Richardson appeared at my office within hours, his usual calm replaced by barely contained anger. "You accessed restricted files," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Files that required clearances you don't have. What you did is a federal crime, Dr. Webb. We could prosecute you, destroy your career, possibly send you to prison. But you won't," I said, with more confidence than I felt. Because prosecuting me would require acknowledging what Project Elderwood really is, what you're really doing with those creatures. And that's the last thing you want going into open court, even a closed national security court. Richardson's expression became calculating. "What do you want?" "I want you to leave them alone. Completely. Shut down the monitoring. Abandon the relocation plans. Classify the entire program so deeply that no future administration will revive it. Let them fade back into legend where they belong." Impossible. Even if I wanted to, which I don't. There are too many stakeholders now. Military intelligence, biosecurity divisions, even corporate interests through defense contractors. The program has momentum that goes beyond any individual's authority to stop. Then I'll go public. I have documentation, photographs, recordings. I have 14 years of field notes detailing every interaction. I have evidence that will make their existence undeniable and your exploitation of them indefensible. Richardson smiled, and this time it was genuine, if cold. "No, you don't. You have a collection of materials that will be thoroughly debunked within 48 hours of publication. We've been preparing for this contingency since the 1950s. We have protocols for discrediting witnesses, explaining away evidence, making anyone who claims to have proof look like a crackpot or a hoaxer. You'll be destroyed professionally, dismissed as another Bigfoot believer who fabricated data to support his delusions. And while you're dealing with that, we'll proceed with our plans, now with added urgency, since you've demonstrated that the secret is becoming unstable." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "You could have helped them, Dr. Webb. Your relationship with them, your knowledge of their behavior and communication. You could have made the relocation humane, ensured their needs were met within the program's constraints. Instead, you've chosen ideological purity over practical outcomes. When they go extinct, and they will, within our lifetimes. Remember that your refusal to compromise contributed to that outcome. After he left, I sat in the empty office and faced the reality of my situation. Richardson was right about the debunking protocols. I'd seen them deployed against other witnesses over the years. The systematic destruction of credibility that left people broken and dismissed. Going public wasn't a viable option, but he was wrong about one thing. I wasn't choosing ideological purity. I was choosing the only ethical path I could see. If I couldn't stop the government's plans, if I couldn't protect the creatures through official channels, then I would do what I should have done from the beginning. I would ask them what they wanted, truly listen to their answer, and do everything in my power to help them achieve it, regardless of the personal cost. I had one card left to play, one option Richardson didn't know about because it came from indigenous knowledge rather than government intelligence. A way to help the creatures disappear so completely that even satellites and thermal imaging wouldn't find them. But it required betraying every agreement I'd made with Project Elderwood, violating federal laws, and accepting that I'd probably spend the rest of my life as a fugitive. The question was whether I had the courage to do it. I returned to the Bitterroot Range in September, 2 months earlier than usual, traveling by routes designed to shake any surveillance. I'd left my phone at home, drove a borrowed vehicle registered to a friend who owed me favors and didn't ask questions, and entered the wilderness from an access point I'd never used before. If Richardson's people were tracking me, and they certainly were, I needed to buy enough time for one final conversation with the beings I'd spent 14 years trying to understand. They were waiting for me, not at our usual meeting place, but at the canyon where the Elder had first shown me their hidden history. The entire extended family was present, along with representatives from other territories I'd never met. This was more than a council meeting. This was a gathering of the last free remnants of a species deciding its own fate. The Elder signed a greeting that carried weight beyond its simple words. "We felt your struggle. We know you found the truth. Now we decide together." I spent the next several hours sharing everything I'd learned about Project Elderwood, about the real agenda behind relocation, about the 3 who died in Nevada and what their deaths actually meant. I held nothing back, translating technical documents into signs they could understand, explaining the government's capabilities and limitations, making sure they comprehended the full scope of what they were facing. When I finished, the silence was profound. They didn't sign questions or reactions. They simply sat, processing information that confirmed their worst suspicions while also revealing new dimensions of the threat they faced. Finally, a female I'd never met before, an elder from a northern territory, judging by her darker fur and the patterns of scarring that suggested different terrain, signed a question that cut to the heart of everything. If we run, if we hide deeper than their machines can find, will you come with us? Will you abandon your world to help preserve ours? I hadn't expected that. In all my planning and strategizing, I'd thought about helping them escape, providing them with information and resources, maybe running interference with government tracking efforts. But actually joining them? Living permanently in the wilderness, giving up everything I'd built in human society, becoming a bridge between species not through occasional meetings, but through complete immersion? The honest answer was that I didn't know if I could do it. I was 40 years old, my body already showing signs of wear from years of field work. I wasn't adapted for their lifestyle, their diet, their constant movement through terrain that would challenge the best human mountaineers. Within a few years, I'd become a burden rather than an asset. But I also understood what they were really asking. Not whether I'd literally live with them, but whether I was willing to sacrifice my place in human society completely to become a permanent exile who could never return to the world I'd known. Because helping them disappear meant I'd have to disappear too. Richardson had made that clear. If they vanished, I'd be the primary suspect, the obvious person who'd facilitated their escape. I'd be hunted, investigated, possibly imprisoned. Yes, I signed, surprising myself with the certainty. I'll help you whatever it takes, even if it means I can never go back. The elder stood and approached me, and in a gesture I'd never experienced before, placed both massive hands on my shoulders. The touch was gentle, but the message was clear. This was commitment, a bond that couldn't be broken without dishonor. I'd just pledged my life to their survival, and they'd accepted that pledge. What followed over the next 3 weeks was the most intensive collaboration I'd ever experienced. The creatures had knowledge I'd barely glimpsed, about cave systems that didn't appear on any geological surveys, about territorial boundaries established through generations of careful observation, about resources and routes that would allow them to survive in regions even more remote than their current homes. But they needed my human knowledge to make the plan work. I helped them understand satellite coverage patterns, identifying blind spots in the surveillance grid. I taught them about the timing of aerial surveys and the capabilities of different sensor technologies. I shared everything I knew about government tracking methods and how to evade them. And in exchange, they taught me survival skills I'd never imagined learning. How to move through wilderness without leaving traces that satellites could detect. How to identify food sources that sustain them. How to think in seasonal patterns rather than human schedules. They were preparing me not just to help them escape, but to potentially survive if I needed to vanish too. The exodus began in October, carefully timed to coincide with the early season storms that would disrupt satellite imaging and ground-based tracking. Family groups moved separately, following different routes toward predetermined gathering points in the most remote sections of the Canadian Rockies and the Yukon Territory. Elders who couldn't make the journey were hidden in cave systems, cared for by the young who would shuttle between old and new territories until the transition was complete. I played my part, creating false trails and evidence that suggested the creatures had moved east rather than north, leaving just enough clues to keep Richardson's people focused on the wrong search areas. It bought time, maybe weeks, before they realized the entire population had vanished. The last group I helped relocate included the elder and the family I'd known longest. We stood together at the Canadian border, unmarked wilderness that existed beyond political boundaries, and the elder signed a farewell that I'll carry for the rest of my life. You gave us the gift of choice. Not survival, that's never guaranteed, but the chance to choose our own path, even if it leads to extinction. That's freedom. That's worth more than safety. Thank you for understanding what your people have forgotten. Some lives are meant to be lived free or not at all. They melted into the northern wilderness, and I turned south, back toward a world that would soon be hunting me with the same intensity they'd once devoted to tracking the creatures I'd just helped disappear. I'm writing this in 2024, 40 years after Richardson appeared on my doorstep, 14 years after I last saw the elder and that northern family group. I've lived under different names, in different countries, always moving, always watching for signs that the government has finally caught up with me. But I've also stayed connected, through channels I can't describe, to knowledge that the creatures survived their exodus. Not all of them. Some of the elders didn't make the journey, and a few young ones were lost to accidents and the harsh conditions of their new territories. But they survived as a people, as a culture, with their autonomy intact. The government still looks for them occasionally, but the search has become perfunctory, a legacy program that no one believes will find anything. Officially, the North American Gigantopithecus is assumed extinct, another victim of habitat loss and human expansion. Let them believe that. Let the legend fade back into myth where it belongs. Because I know the truth. They're still out there, still free, still choosing their own fate. And that knowledge is worth every sacrifice I made, every year of exile, every moment of looking over my shoulder. The mountain keeps its secrets, and so do I. Marcus Webb was never found by federal authorities. The Project Elderwood files were reclassified in 1991 and remain sealed. Occasional reports of large, bipedal creatures continue to emerge from the remote regions of the Yukon and northern British Columbia, but they are universally dismissed as folklore and misidentification. The creatures, if they still exist, have reclaimed the invisibility that allowed them to survive for millennia. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some freedoms are worth any price to preserve, and some choices, once made, echo across generations in ways we can barely imagine.